Okay, lecture 14, CBPR and the development of new interventions and evaluation. I think if we go back to the first lecture, that what is a crucial component in all CBPR work is intervention. And that is the target of the, if one looks at the action research approach. You identify the problem, you carry out research, you formulate an action plan, reflect and evaluate action in it's a constant process. So, and it's something that I often find is underdeveloped in many of the CBPR texts. It's also implicit within the process of practice and action that is spoken about by many of the early theoreticians. Now, interventions can take multiple forms. These can be direct action by committee, community organizations, in the form of protests, lobbying, political action. So the community organizations might have it in their power to make certain changes in the community, and they can make those changes. This is obviously generally the easiest thing to do. If that authority rests with a group outside of the immediate body in the community, then there may be political action, protest, or lobbying action needs to take place. And this action can be taken through the city council or to employer bodies, to companies that are operating in the community. All of these are ways, because it might just be that, if we take the alcohol example, it might just be that identified that local shops are selling to shebeens illegally, or maybe they're selling to underage youth. So there can be direct action taken against them to change their practices. It can be interventions developed by the research team. And that's not just you, that's you with the community groupings. Any interventions developed on a joint basis with some of these city council or health department or something like that. And very often intervention, and the intervention I'll talk about later, is something that's developed on a joint basis by multiple role players. And then there are policy contributions. We want, where the grouping might recommend certain additions to policy or assessments or ways of looking at policy. Direct action by, so many can be direct action by community organizations. Many of the interventions developed as part of CBPR can be immediate interventions. These can be seen as part of the CBPR work. Each period of work should lead to some kind of intervention for future planning. And need to keep a focus on intervention to keep the community involved and interested. The community is not going to stick around just for the sake of the research. And a lot of CBPR processes, research processes, do make that error of going in and involving community, but actual work ends at a publication or report about the community. Now, the community remain interested in that is unlikely. It's not something that's benefiting them, something that in fact could be potentially embarrassing or harmful to them. So you really need to be working with them. So many of these might be small. It might be the research team or the committee talking to shebeen owners about closing time or noise. As one example. So litter against, if one of the issues that has arisen around the Substance Abuse is that drinking with the shebeens to open till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. then there can be something done about closing those early, working with the Shebeen owners. I know just on our work in Delft, there's one particular venue that created enormous problem in the community. They operated until very, very late at night and blocked off a road because the venue ran across two, the Shebeen ran across two venues across the road from each other. So it literally blocked off the entire road, put up barricades and have a party all night in the middle of the community. So in the ways in which the community can take action against that, developing educational pamphlets, so on the Darrell issue, developing an educational pamphlet on hand cleaning that is understandable by the community and can be distributed by members of the committee. It's an easy to do action. Cleaning up glass in an area of the community so children will not cut themselves in the play area. Sometimes, one of the problems might be there's lack of facilities for children, but there is this open field, so maybe the community can draw together and clean up an area. And these can extend to larger self-run interventions, maybe cleaning up and painting a building for use by youth. There might be an abandoned building in the community that's under the ownership of the city council, or under the ownership of some separate authority, that can be cleaned up and painted and then can be turned into a facility for some of the youth. Or by providing additional support to pregnant women to ensure that they can attend antenatal classes. And maybe just community members organizing on a block basis so that transport can be provided to women during the final stages of pregnancy. All of these are very small, manageable interventions that can be seen to arise from it. And community members can see real benefit from each of these. There can be a feeling of a real benefit arising and a real change being made in the community, although the efforts are quite small. They can become focused. That's almost your easy targets that can develop easily. The next step is really around the political protest or lobbying action can take many forms. It's from personal visits by individuals to service or elected representatives to request action. And we've seen this in some of the campaigns that have been run, and I meant to look up the name of the group, but I haven't got it in my head right now, but I think it's on tomorrow morning's lecture. It's really a community activist group at the Pooh campaign in Cape Town. Yeah. But in that is really, it's operated on community base. There's community activists coming together and gradually building. Now there are debates as to whether that is really only about sanitary conditions or whether it's around a broader political campaign. But it's that kind of action around the provision of adequate toilets is another aspect of the work. It would be another aspect of the work around the anti-diarrheal, reducing diarrhea in underage children. And that started with protests and petitions, and then went on to the more explicit action. And so these visits are kind of a first action we might take if there's a request for, example, improvement in water quality, improvement in resources, or improvement in flood protection or drainage, so that the stagnant water doesn't sit there, which is a risk to the children. So a first step might be to go and visit if no action and to request certain behaviors. If these are not requests, then action can be upgraded. And that upgrading of action can include petitions and multiple signatures, talking to the press and other media, can include direct protest action. Obviously, all of these are gradually building in terms of intensity. The picketing of buildings, broader community mobilization, pamphlets and mass meetings, going to some more central authorities, amongst others. And obviously you have to decide as a researcher what you're comfortable with and to what extent you are comfortable with. with many of these. But as a community activist as well, and by working in with the community, you often commit yourselves into a process. But you might not want to go as far as selling, as far as throwing feces. And that's where you'd have to decide for yourself where the limits are and make sure that these are clear to the community. You cannot obviously stop the community from taking action further, but you just don't participate in that next step. And you have to take consequences for that if necessary. And it's very seldom that a strong community grouping will go that far. Be aware of work at a community level throughout. Also be aware of the restrictions of your own institution. And there might be certain restrictions within the academic institution from being involved in certain of the issues. And you have to decide to what extent you're prepared to confront your own institution. And the desire from action will vary from within the community, from doing very little to taking extreme action. But from having worked in the 80s in the political organizations, there's often these issues can take a very strongly emotional overtone. And you have to work with the community to find the right approach. You'll generally follow a staged approach where you'll first start with representation and then maybe petitions and going to higher authorities, then maybe build in a larger movement, and you'd have to just assess at what point this is worth it and what gains you're going to make. You have to listen to what arguments are coming back against you. So you've got to balance the potential benefits and risks and costs in each action and see this against the importance of the issue. And also just be aware that there are different sectors of the community. So if you're working on, say, whatever, you might be that, if you're working, very often it's the youth that present a more militant form. So you might get a more militant set of youth that are wanting to take on the police or wanting to take on city council and wanting to march and on city council offices and barricade themselves in offices until effective systems are taken. Bizarrely on the other side, within the shebeens, it's generally the older women that are wanting to take a more militant approach and march on the shebeens and close them down, or get the police to come in and close them down. So, but it's a process of working through, and it's also recognizing that this political action is an effective form of intervention, particularly if you're talking about interventions that are beyond the control or implementation of the grouping. These aren't necessarily against political groupings. They could be against companies. So as I said, if maybe an alcohol company is selling alcohol to underage youth, or they're providing alcohol to illegal venues directly, then that might be a way of taking them on. Might be that, or a company that's providing very poor working conditions might also be something that you can tackle. Development and adaptation of new interventions. Large interventions require an extended time and resources and require additional time. So it might be that there are these new interventions that can work. These could include or require the input of multiple players. So you might be talking about the integration of state, NGO, and CBO processes into the intervention. These can be developed from scratch. So something might be to develop a system of support around new mothers, so that they can, and that might include drawing additional services in at the clinic level. It might mean drawing in some of the CBOs of some of the women's organizations and trying to draw them into providing. There are often NGOs attached to the clinics that can also be drawn into providing service. So all of these might have to come together, and then with a specific project function from group as well. It might lead to some kind of educational process or support process around that early period. So that's a kind of, so these can be developed from scratch or can be adapted interventions in other contexts. In CBPR, you can legitimately use all legal resources. So just, something has been done effectively somewhere else and it can be adapted. It does save a huge amount of additional work. Not everything has to be done from scratch. And I'll talk about an adaptation process later. Example can include the introduction of new services, such as maybe as a new service for for new mothers. The clinic offers something, the NGOs offer some additional counselling, local CBOs offer house support and visits and transport. It might be the development of a counselling program. Domestic violence is a particular issue, or substance abuse. So to work with, if someone's working with substance abuse, one might work with, say, the Matrix organization in Delft, which is one of the key groupings for addressing substance abuse. But then also just work with maybe some of the church structures or some of the school structures where they're counselors, so they can also might be bringing up, developing taking a counselling program, taking a counselling skills session from the Matrix and passing this on to people working at the clinics or in the schools. So the ways of adapting and working within this. It might require the setting up of infrastructure. This is often a lot harder if one needs to put a building into place. So there's the idea in the early intervention of setting up a youth facility, cleaning up a building, etc. But if one wants to do something more constructive there and start doing skills training, you might want to bring in NGO groupings from that community and surrounding communities to do skills training so that they can operate services there on a regular basis. Or changes in standard operations in the community. This might, and some of it is quite simple, but some of it might require a lot more effort. Changing of clinic hours, changing the nature of services, changing the way schools operate to provide additional community services. Again, if one goes back to the action research approach, evaluation is fundamental to CBPR. So as in all intervention research, but it's within CBPR, it is a constant reflection backwards through of the process. These can occur in a large workshop where you just pull everybody together and they discuss what happened. So if you're doing something on a political campaign or the activism, there's not, you might have some measurable impacts, the number of people that attended, the number of signatures you obtained to get some measurable implications. But at the same time, what you'll be also looking at is seeing, getting a sense of the community participation, community contribution. So you have these large workshops where community members talk about the intervention, how it went, how to improve it. So, I did talk about implicitly, maybe the Marchand City Council produced an acknowledgement that there is a problem and a statement that they will introduce a more rapid process for repairing toilets, but they're not in a position to put in new toilets. So you start to evaluate those as impacts and responses within the community. This obviously can require quite a structured process for discussion. And you might start looking at small group discussions and some of the other tools around it, and they use stickies about their feelings about the responses. It's often a good way of organizing sets of responses. But there does need to be systems to the evaluation. So all interventions should be subject to some kind of joint evaluation. Impact evaluation, sorry? By the researchers and community members, yeah. Preferably together. There might be, as within the CBPR approach, it is preferable that they are done together. But there might be aspects that you would have to manage, and there might be aspects of the data. And I think your case is somewhat different, Kara, because of your virtual community. I'm not sure how there's a whole string of issues you have to cope with, and hopefully the lecture tomorrow will deal with that in a little bit more detail when I look at virtual communities. Well, I'm not sure yours is a virtual community. Yeah. But it's because the community, because you took the action with the community, because you did the research with the community, they need to be part of the evaluation. They need to buy in the evaluation and have a sense of, they need to own the results that have been seen to be obtained. So impact evaluation does always remain important. But within CBPR, process evaluation takes on a much, much greater role, much greater significance.
We're talking about evaluation, and I'm assuming it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
You use evaluation with monitoring as well. I'm just wondering how would you go about monitoring and continuous involvement in these groups? That's a problem from
Yeah, so I've been intending to put the two into one. With monitoring, well, I mean, you'd be looking at level of engagement. So if you work in a geographic community, which is much easier, you'd be looking at attendance at meetings, participation in those meetings, what sectors are represented, when you're doing your research and data gathering. A lot of it does revolve around the representation, and then who's seen to be, who's happy with the intervention that's taking place. What are the results? What is the impact of that on them? Yeah. Yeah, it probably is a good idea to incorporate monitoring as well. So that is my error. But I tend to think of it all as evaluation. So it's partly a terminology thing. And it will be a process when you're sitting with the team that you're constantly evaluating. Suddenly you'll find that the youth are no longer coming into your meetings. You'd need to look at what's going on. So it's a matter of constantly reflecting on the process and what's going on, and seeing that this is working. So as with other, and I think that's where, it's a constant assessing of whether you're taking the community with you, or whether you're still in one mind with the community. And if you suddenly start to find that you're haggling with the community on a continual basis, you need to start looking at where those distinctions and differences started to arise and why there are differences between where you are and where the community is. They need to be happy with the measures and the outcomes that you're describing. They also need to understand and agree with the evaluation process, so they need to be involved in the development of that. And what's quite important for impact evaluation, you need to decide with community members what the desired outcome should be. And this should be in some way measurable. And goals should be attainable. I mean, it's one of the difficult issues is that a person, the committee might come in wanting to wipe out drug addiction or substance abuse and diarrhea with one intervention. This is not going to be feasible. As we all would know from years of experience, but there's that you need that. So what could happen is that you run what is a fairly successful intervention. There's significant reductions in both, but the community is very unhappy because there's still cases presenting. So there needs to be this process from very early on of saying, okay, this intervention is likely to work, and this is what would you consider an acceptable target? 5% reductions in cases of diarrhea, this reduction in terms of substance use in the community. Okay. Because what can happen then is, and particularly if one's looking at the political campaigns, you need to look at what comes from that. And if that is, a single visit to the city council is not going to produce every change that you need and that you want in the community. But if you start to get some benefits from it, accept those as victories, because that also builds your CBPR approach. The more victories you can have, the stronger the community starts to feel, the more empowered they feel. And I think that's an important part of monitoring and evaluation and the process is that feeling of empowerment. So let's just look a little bit at the process evaluation. Process evaluation can include observations of the interventions and actions, interviews with the facilitators and beneficiaries. We talk to secondary beneficiaries. Can use a mixture of research staff and community staff to collect the data, and can prepare observation discussion schedules, encourage a range of positive and negative sides and contextual factors. This is looking more, if an intervention does go into the field, how did that march, how did they feel that action took place? What changes have taken place, observations of intervention action. If this area is cleaned up and the toilets are improved, what change, how did that, are the toilets now working adequately? Are the fields or the bushes or the pathways now clear? It's just talking about the process in which that happened, how it happened, how the community feels about it. Secondary beneficiaries are those who, so that might be the mothers of the children or fathers or the clinic staff in terms of reduced rate of diarrhea being presented. What you're talking about, what you're talking about is a whole string of process measures. One process measure that I didn't really talk about now here is the sense of community empowerment. And I think in terms of the monitoring, what you were talking about earlier, Kiara, is the sense of empowerment and to find ways of understanding that sense in which community feels empowered to actually be able to understand, take control of the issues that are facing it. I think it's a very strong measure of the ongoing success of the CBPR approach as against of individual interventions. And how one measures empowerment is complicated. It is a sense of participation in meetings, a sense of capacity to argue cases, a sense of groupings that were disempowered before. Maybe young women might be now feel more empowered to participate in meetings. So it's these kinds of issues that start to address and start to look at empowerment. And then there are the CBPR approaches that we spoke about earlier. I think the asset and risk mapping is a very powerful tool because it's able to send people out again once intervention has happened, and they do another risk and asset mapping. Maybe you should start to see a reduction in the risks and increase in the number of assets in the community. Of course, you might find an increase in the number of risks, but that might also just be related to a greater awareness of what these factors are. So you need to understand these tools. You can do another SWOT measure, another positive deviance, another Photoshop. All of these are ways in which, and these are methods that community groups would have done on a joint basis, and they would have analyzed together. So it's often much more at their heart than a survey or a qualitative interview. And so if they can see differences in maps, for example, or in a photo voice essay that's done, then maybe there's a greater sense of the empowerment and what's changed. There are challenges to this. Experimental approaches are often hard to set up. And the notions of controls are very difficult to accept. So what is an acceptable? Well, experimental approaches of people, one group getting intervention, another group not getting, is often very difficult for communities to accept, particularly if they believe that this is intervention they've worked on. And the systems of randomization are also difficult to accept. Why can't we just give it to those that most need it and have the controls of those that need it less? Now bear in mind that experimental approach is not always required. It's required only in the specific circumstances and can be a really hard sell in a community setting. So you need to be aware of when and how to advocate for it. And it's not always appropriate. It's only really on certain of the individuals that can be interventions that can be delivered on an individual basis. And you can argue things like giving the intervention to controls at a later basis. Another challenge is that there's often a lot of investment in the interventions developed. So something is developed by the community and they put their heart and soul into it. Often it's harder to accept critiques. So maybe one of the interventions is to close down, is to make sure all the shebeens close at 11 o'clock rather than 1 o'clock. But they find that after a month or two, this is not having an impact on substance use. The people are just stocking up on alcohol ahead of time. Or they're moving their alcohol from alcohol use to tech use or other drugs. So, and sometimes those kinds of interventions have quite a strong emotional load in the community. So you've got to work quite carefully with interventions with critiques of such interventions, where the community has to now accept that something new has to be tried. And there might be high emotions attached to campaigns for change. And you have to balance this anger at the reality of improving the intervention. Well, how can this be improved? How can we not just change, okay, closing the shebeens early impacts on certain groups but not on others. So how can we impact more with these others? Do we need to start providing alternative services to them? Do we need to, but these need to be based on the findings of the evaluation. And if the community members are involved in that evaluation, it also increases their investment in it. And if they see the link of that to the intervention. Bias and subjectivity need to be taken into account with investment around the intervention or parts of it. With that investment in the interventions I spoke about, accuracy and unbiased reporting becomes hard. And remember, pure objectivity is not really the target, but an acknowledged subjectivity. And even if one is doing survey work or quantitative work, there is that sense very often of people wanting to fudge the data or wanting to make the intervention look good. You need to just make sure that that subjectivity or that need for bias, that need to prove that something is working, is not interfering. So you need to work constantly with your community partners to acknowledge subjectivity. And particularly when you're starting to look at links that are assumed or made, like shebeens are the ones responsible for substance abuse in the community. And if you start to close them down, you've got to start changing, maybe you have to start changing that understanding at the community level. It's not only the shebeens that people access alcohol or other substances from multiple sources. And very often the tendency in research is to identify the negative, particularly in academia, and to look at areas for improvement. There's a need to constantly be working on the positives to make sure almost that the positives coming out of any evaluation get a higher profile. What is a fundamental measure for success? I spoke a little bit about this earlier. Frustration can arise easily if a problem is not eradicated in the first or second attempt. And the problems like both substance abuse and diarrhea are incredibly complex problems to address, and will need and require multiple interventions to be eradicated. In many cases, cannot be completely eradicated. So you need to identify what is an adequate success level. And with whom would that, so you work with, so whether that's in terms of dealing with a problem like diarrhea or dealing with political change, and setting the objectives of the intervention is, so part of setting the interventions is setting the interventions of success is part of that evaluation process and part of the design process. But you have to find a way that is sufficient for the community to feel satisfied. But that is also possible within the intervention. And there is this tendency in health research to look at what makes a significant difference. But very often a significant difference is not a meaningful difference at a community level. So one's got to move away from that. And I think you'd be looking on the one hand at statistical change. You're also looking at what is meaningful in terms of the community level. And I noted that particularly from large studies where you can get a significant difference at a 1% or 0.5% change in behavior. And I can't imagine too many community members being particularly happy with that level of change. Translation processes, especially working in South Africa, you may need to work with multiple languages. Also sources of documents on interventions and elsewhere are often in English. So translation is complicated. Not all languages have the same lexicon. And there's a particular issue when we're working on HIV interventions, because many of, or certainly found in Xhosa, that there often aren't words for many of the sexual body parts or sexual behaviors, sexual actions, and it had to work in metaphor. And even that was often created problems because it was hard to distinguish, say, the labella from the vagina from other body parts. And some of that is necessary in talking about sexual health. In my experience, it's better, and particularly I think with CBPR, for community members to do the translations. It is more accurate translations because it's something that's familiar to the local dialect. It is cheaper and it can also capture local idiom. Working in Delft, we do translations into Xhosa and Afrikaans, but if we're doing interventions, I might start looking at, there's a peculiar combination of English, Afrikaans and because of that spoken sections of Delft. And certain words that are more expressive have crossed lexicons. So it might be useful to start to incorporate some of that in interventions done at a very local level. Also, if you're doing educational interventions, if you really buy in at that local idiom level, it often increases identification and thereby understanding and usage or acceptance of the messages. If a community intervention is not adequately successful, so say in Delft we were working on these two issues of substance abuse and diarrhea, but there's a particular subsection, say the youth. We wanted also to add an intervention around provision of youth facilities, sports facilities. And they agreed to put the issue on hold until others were resolved. Now, if an intervention is not adequately resolved in one or two interventions, there's this need to carry on working on it. But you do need to acknowledge that there are other issues in the community that also need to be addressed. And it's playing this balancing act of when to introduce a new issue and put a current issue on the back burner. You don't want to overload the committee by starting to address 4, 5 or 6 issues. It just creates an additional load on you and the community members who are involved in the work. And particularly in a case where there are limited resources. Now, there might be ways of tying issues together. So, say substance abuse is an issue. One of the solutions might be to provide additional facilities for youth. So it might be possible to tie the issues together, but it's not all, that wouldn't always be the case. Okay. What I'm going to do now is, are there any questions at this point? No. Such a compliant group class. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the development we did. While the studies themselves are not necessarily community-based, I think they are good examples of drawing community involvement and using a CBPR type approach in the development of interventions. These are 2 interventions used for assisting. Their focus was on assisting parents to talk to adolescents about HIV. We did a community program in Langa, and we did that was done at Georgia State University. Sorry, spell check. And then there's a workshop program, and that was a worksite program done with the Cape Town City Council, and that was done with Harvard University. Both started an intervention that had been developed and worked well with the US. So we started with those interventions, and the first step was the US researchers sat down and removed from, and both had an intervention manual. And the US researchers sat and removed all the direct references to the US. But while the 2 interventions had a similar program, there were somewhat differences, and I think there are advantages to both. And the reality is the difference between the 2 approaches depended on partially on people we were collaborating with, and partially on the funding system that we used. The Langer study had less funding. We held a 4-day meeting in Cape Town, so that we had a program that had been used in African American communities in the US, and we held a 4-day. So this is what we brought into Cape Town. We held a 4-day workshop in our meeting room upstairs. And that we had reps from the US, so 2 academics from there, had reps from Stellenbosch University. We had from Child Welfare, who was our community partner in this exercise. And we had parenting and child NGOs, particularly the Parent Centre, and RAPCAN was another one, big one that made a lot of input. Then we had community workers from Langa, as well as parents from Langa community, and one woman who ran a small orphanage kind of system in Langa. So for the first 1.5 days we presented our program, and each of the NGOs presented ideas from their program. And so we basically, the US program was presented in each of the states, not in a huge amount of detail, but it took about 3/4 of the day, and we spoke about each of the program. That was, I think, it was an 8-workshop program. And then each parent centre presented some of their training that they did, and RAPCAN presented some of their training that they did, and they directed their inputs really around gaps that they perceived in the program from the US. Then we set about rebuilding the program from scratch. And one of the first issues that arose was we couldn't really work on 8 one-hour sessions, so we decided to change that to a smaller number of 6 1.5 to 2 hour sessions, or 6 2-hour sessions with the provision of a meal to the mothers that came.
How did you select these parents?
From the community to attend the workshop. They were selected by the community workers from child welfare. So these were parents that they'd had contact with, and they felt generally were good parents and who could contribute to this.
Did they go back to the community?
No, there wasn't that form. So it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't a genuine CBPR approach, in that we weren't really involved and entrenched in Langa or in the city council. But it's just more the process of working that I'm wanting to present and give an understanding for. So yes, there were holes in the program, in that it wasn't something that had been raised by the communities as something crucial. It was something we raised funding for and then sought out community reps. But it's a system and way of working that I think is useful to now look at and understand. So we then went through the program, rebuilding it from scratch. And literally for the next 2.5 days, we mapped out these 6 sessions of 2 hours, and what would be said in each session, what the priorities were. And in many respects, a lot of what was in the original program was dumped very rapidly. And there's a lot more discussion around, well, how to actually start talking about sex. Because none of the reps from any of the communities had any idea of talking to their children about sex in any way at all. And it was actually quite interesting in the exercise that one of the parents, the father, had come in, and he came back very proudly on the 4th day and said he'd sat down with his 2 sons and spoke to them about condoms the night before. It was the first time he'd ever been able to talk to them about sex. And a lot of the discussion revolved around condom sizes, but it was still a good start. And what also struck us very rapidly is that there was a lot of fear of actually talking to the adolescent children generally. And so just finding ways to actually open up those lines of communication. So there were a lot of exercises introduced. And because it was a community-run campaign, we were able to bring the adolescents into 2 of the sessions. They were able to sit in on 2 of the sessions and do exercises with their parents for 2 of the sessions and talking. After the exercise, this was rewritten up, and the core team met again in Atlanta to advise and add to it. It was then submitted to translation by committee, which is, we had originally started the black translation structure, but we evolved very rapidly to this translation by committee system. which essentially meant that we had our field workers who were familiar with the community and reflect occasionally back with child welfare people who were going to be doing the training. And they would thrash through it and start to translate this intervention into Xhosa. And how to deal with the problematic constructs around sexual words, around disease, and around various other issues where there weren't the words for it. How to deal with issues respectfully, etc. And then this was presented to the community workers who were going to do the training, and they requested further changes to the program. Finally, is run by two groups with two controls. The interventions were run in a classroom in Langa, and the catering was by a local woman. And if you remember going back to the first and second blocks, you don't run anything in the community without providing catering. And it was very interesting because if we'd done the catering ourselves, we'd never managed it. We had an incredibly limited budget. And this woman somehow produced, for a profit, I'm sure, meals for 8 people for about 400 Rand. So it was mostly pap and boerewors and some vegetables in the sauce. But the mothers left very happy and sometimes taking food home for a little bit of food home for their families. So it was just working through this kind of system. Parents got really involved in the process, and there was huge excitement by the end of the program. I attended the first and the last sessions of these. I didn't go to all because I didn't want to be, I wasn't sure that I would be a good presence sitting on the outside of the group. But what was very interesting is in the last session, parents were talking very excitedly with the adolescents, which had not happened before, and the adolescents had also become involved. From the Cape Town City Council, we'd learned a lot of lessons from the first program. We did structure it slightly differently. We had a 2-day workshop where we presented the program, and there were reps from the US, from Stellenbosch University, from Cape Town City Council Wellness Program, from a range of NGOs, and we also had representatives from other commercial enterprises, so from ShopRite and 1 or 2 other industry reps. And we had to get direction. The main thing at this point we wanted, because we had so much input from the previous group, we wanted direction from this group on what to leave out and what new material to add in. Also, we did also get direct content from the Cape Town City Council Wellness Program and from NGOs. And there's a side focus on how to actually run such a thing in South Africa. Because in the US it had run over 6 or 8 lunch hours. It was 8 lunch hours. And what very rapidly became clear is that in South Africa you don't have lunch hours for many working companies. They would get half an hour for lunch, and this was particularly clear from retail companies, but also within the production and manufacturing companies, that they don't get a lunch hour, they get half an hour, but this wasn't a consistent process. And you couldn't be assured that the same workers would have the same lunch hours one week until the next. And so what we ended up working with was, instead of working with lunch hours, was having a reduced number of sessions, having 6 sessions, making them slightly longer and making them fit into a state requirement that all companies provide workers with a certain amount of HIV education every year. So we had to fit it into a different structure. The program was rewritten and presented to an enlarged group, and again another grouping of these community reps that occurred over a day. And further modifications were made, and then translations were made to that. Again, this is translation by committee. Presented this to the trainers from the Cape Town City Council, and they again requested and reflected further changes that would be required. So further changes were made and retranslations. a lot of the concerns coming back regularly were there's too much content. You can't get through this amount. What happens if people want to talk? This was a very tight model that was developed in the US where this presentation would happen and then there'd be 3 minutes conversation. And in African context, people don't talk for 3 minutes. They'll talk for 20 minutes. So we had to try and find ways of adjusting and working with it, of keeping as much content in at the same time as allowing adequate time for discussion. And then we ran the program with one group as a trial. And this was evaluated mostly using process evaluation. And again, it was adapted. One of the key issues that arose there was that people just wanted a space to be able to ask questions around HIV. They also just wanted a space to be able to talk about how to talk to adolescents. Because a lot of the time parents, and I've got an adolescent daughter, and it's really hard sometimes. Sometimes the best conversations happen during ads when you're watching TV. Because it's just a finding a space where there's a comfort, where you can feel comfortable. So these are the discussions and the processes we had to adapt. And again, we had to try and reduce content because there was too much content. These mostly happen at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon once our workers had come off shift. And the focus was really on the low end of the workers, and if there were workers from more senior levels, more high skill levels, they had to be given time off. That, like for the garbage collectors and street cleaners, they would come in to run the session at the end of their shift. And yes, they were given food and cool drinks to make it more pleasant. After this, we presented again to a further enlarged workshop, and this included representatives from the training councils in South Africa, in the different industrial sections. And this was further again adapted. What you see in this constant process of adapting and constant process of changing. As presented to the trainers again, because they had to be retrained for what was going to be the next, because we were then going to do an experimental trial. And further modifications were made. And the key issue is that once the participants started talking to their children, they wanted to come back and talk about this experience. They wanted to come back and share this experience. And so there was the need to try and run it again, to take this into account. They ran the intervention with 4 groups and 4 controls, plus process evaluation. Again, there was great success in terms of the excitement and the parents talking to the adolescents. And again, further modifications were made, and we're still trying to get funding for a larger trial and a rollout of this.